Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Niguse Gemeda Slow Shade Drying Natural Processed Ethiopia from Wes Ngopi. And there's the bag right there. And Wes Ngopi, based out of Shah, Malaysia. And there's a pretty extensive backstory behind this coffee, so let me take you through that real quick. And all of this started in the middle of 2024 when Airworks was bringing on Wes Ngopi for the first time. And in that moment, I'd only ever had one sample of their coffee, which was a wash processed Kenyan coffee. And at that time, Wes Ngopi was roasting extremely light. And the big takeaway I had from that coffee was that they are an extremely light roasting coffee roaster. But it caught my interest enough for us to purchase a Bolivian Geisha from Airworks at that time. Now, Airworks did highly suggest this coffee, as they said it was one of the more enjoyable offerings that Wes Ngopi did have on their website in that moment. And even though we opted not to purchase it, largely due to the processing that it did have, Airworks did still give us a sample of this coffee, and when I finally got around to brewing it, I was extremely impressed with the way that it did turn out. In fact, it easily would have ended up as our favorite natural processed coffee of 2024 had we reviewed it that year. So when Wes Ngopi did re-release this coffee, it's one that we knew we had to purchase. So we're definitely looking forward to discussing this coffee, as this right here is day 65. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This has been a pretty heavy discussion point on our channel over the last couple of months, as this one is the most developed Wes Ngopi coffee that we've reviewed as of this moment. And it did come as a little bit of a surprise, as we'd noticed that once upon a time they were super ultra light, but then it started to skew a little bit more developed to a point where I thought it was still fine. It was still on the more light side of things, but this one right here I would say is a bit closer to that medium light, as it does have a little bit of a roasty quality to it as well, and a little bit more roasty of a quality than I might have expected based off of all of our experiences with this coffee roaster. I wouldn't necessarily say that it skews too far in that direction, but it's a very noticeable shift from where they once were. So hopefully that gives you a good idea. Well, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 33, first impression through the V60, and that was definitely our first takeaway of this coffee, as it was notably more robust than any of the experiences we'd had with this coffee roaster. And I really have to put in context the experience that we did have of that sample that we received from Airworks at that time, given that was still a time when Wes Ngopi was roasting extremely light, and that coffee turned out extremely clean, especially for a natural processed coffee. But that was nowhere near the case with this first impression, as not only did it have a little bit of that more robust, slightly smoky quality, but it did have a fair bit more fermentiness than we experienced from that sample at that time. It does still skew primarily in the blueberry-like sense, with a strong candied sweetness to it as well. Peachiness is also felt in abundance, as it's a slight bit cleaner than the average natural processed coffee, but once again, nowhere near as clean as the experience that we did have from that sample. We move on to day 36, as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's along the same lines of the first impression, with a slight bit less clarity and a candied sweet aspect. Very blueberry forward, but a bit more toned down of a blueberry that carries through a bit more, with the illicit peach coming through at the end. So some slightly mixed impressions this second time around, as the blueberry aspect isn't quite as prominent as that first impression. We move on to day 39, as we opted for the April brewer, and there are more similarities to the first few days, as it's notably more robust than the experiences that we did have in the past, especially with this specific coffee. So I think I had enough of a sample to brew about 3 cups of that coffee back in 2024, and each one of them were just as impressive as the first time I had brewed them, as it just continuously turned out very clean and extremely blueberry forward. It had that classic vintage super clean blueberry bomb feel to it, and this one was nowhere near as clean in that sense, not just in terms of the fermentiness, but also in terms of that roasty quality to it. Prominent berry tones are felt, with a strong perfumey florality coming through at the end. So this one was much more natural-like on this day with this brew method. We move on to day 42 as we opted for the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and there were certainly some mixed results as the coffee does come out a little bit cleaner, but at the cost of some of the pronounced fruit intensity. Primarily the peachiness is a bit more pronounced this time around, as it's giving a little bit more of a generic Ethiopian-like feel, especially in terms of the berry qualities, as they are coming out a little bit more fermenty in general. Day 45 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's still offering a bit more of a generic natural Ethiopian feel to it. So I did feel we needed to start going back in the other direction, because while it was hindered by the smokiness to it, it was at least made up for by a lot of the more intense fruit qualities of the coffee. Slight peachiness coming through at the end, but otherwise pretty direct and heavy in terms of the fermentiness, as well as the prominent perfumey florals and the darker berry tones to it as well. Day 48 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and to our surprise, the coffee did have a notable bit of a revitalization. And even with the profile of this coffee being a little bit more developed than they had in the past, this has been weirdly a theme with this coffee roaster, as for whatever reason, very close to this week 7 mark, usually week 6, week 7 mark in the day 40 range, the coffee just seems to somewhat shift for a very positive way, as this was certainly the case with this coffee, as it was by far the best that had been to this point. Pretty intense, prominent peachiness in the intermediary, notably cleaner and better defined. It is still slightly marred by the overall roastiness of it, but significantly better nonetheless, as a lot of the fruit profiles in this one were much more pronounced and better defined. Day 51 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and it's generally better than the earlier days, but it is still slightly marred by the roastiness, relatively clean otherwise with the berry components that aren't as heavy as an average natural processed Ethiopian coffee, and better definition to the fruit qualities overall, so improved. And then final notes we have on day 54, opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's slightly better yet again, but I'm going to continue going back to the fact that it was hindered by the roasty quality of it, as it does have a very long-lasting finish. Otherwise, some pretty blueberry and peach buried underneath, as I feel like had this coffee just been perhaps a touch cleaner than a lot of those characteristics, a touch cleaner and a touch lighter, a lot of those characteristics would have shown through a lot more in the way that they did the first time I tried this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through those. We'll start with the finish, level 4. I did mention that it has a much more prominent and pronounced lingering finish to this coffee, but even then, it's not to the extent where it's overbearing whatsoever. So level 4, higher side of level 4 is where we opted to put it. Mostly comes out in the berry scent, so I think they have blueberry, strawberry listed on here, and I can feel an abundance of those, as well as the peachy qualities to it. It is a wide array of fruit qualities within this one. Sweetness level 4, very sweet coffee, a lot of fruit sweetness to this one. I continuously focus on the berry qualities within it because those were by far the most pronounced characteristics to it, so that's what we're opting to go for in terms of the sweetness. Florality level 4, that kind of classic perfumey floral, that dark florality that you experience with a lot of natural processed Ethiopian coffees, presented throughout the entirety of this one, a very consistent note within this coffee. Now we'll get into the fruit qualities, berry fruit level 4. I think that's going to be a little bit difficult of a pill for me to swallow because the original sample we had of this coffee was easily a level 5. It had that very clean blueberry bomb that would have easily scored there in that very high sense. I think that they have blueberry and strawberry as notes listed on here for it, and I can see both, especially given that there is a bit of a red fermentiness to this coffee that does somewhat skew it as well. So plenty of berries, I would say easily the most pronounced fruit quality within this one. Let's go ahead and move on to level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Not the brightest coffee, though I think every single coffee that we have reviewed from Wes Ngopi recently or this year outside of the Kenya has scored at that level 3 mark in terms of the acidity. So it's usually not the case when it comes to Wes Ngopi that we score any higher than that, but this one still finishing in that more middle ground of that level 3 mark. Stone fruit level 3. The peachiness showed so much potential. It peaks through a lot of the time, but it's buried underneath the much more intense florality, the much more intense berry fruit qualities, and that slight roastiness to it as well. So it's there, and I feel like it's something that could be unlocked a little bit more. It was also a bit more pronounced in the sample that we'd received earlier, so it probably could have scored a level 4 on the first impression of this coffee. Let's go ahead and move on to the body level 2, I want to discuss that first real quick. Not necessarily the most amount of texture, didn't expect it to have that much given that it is an Ethiopian coffee. Just wanted to run through that real quick. And then the most important thing we'll discuss these two things alongside each other. Cleanliness level 3, smokiness level 2. For all of the Wes Ngopi coffees that we have had, I don't think I've experienced too much roastiness to it, too much smokiness to it. I have noticed a pretty significant shift from the first time we had tried them. I can't harp enough on the fact that that washed Ethiopian sample we received was just so unbelievably light. And then from that point going forward, the Bolivian coffee that we had from them was also extremely light. But those, as well as the sample of this coffee that we received, I want to say it was around June, July, August timeframe, was super light. And then from that point going forward, not to the same extent, and I noticed that it continuously got a slight bit more developed to the point where here we are at this moment, and it is the most developed it had been to this point. That being said, we've seen some messages that people have had back and forth with Wes Ngopi, and it seems like they're aware that there had been a little bit of a shift in their coffee. They did recently make a change on the roasting machine that they were using around the time frame that this coffee was released, which explains a lot of the issues that not only we've had, but a lot of other people have had with this coffee. And it's a very important thing to discuss because there is enough smokiness to justify it being there at the level 2 mark, and we usually only reserve that level 2 for coffees that we can feel it enough to the point where we do need to highlight it. It's not to the point where it's overly strong to maybe a level 3. That does indicate usually a fair bit closer to a medium profile for a coffee in general, but it is pronounced enough to not just skew that part of the tasting wheel, but also the cleanliness. And also, in fairness, the cleanliness probably wasn't going to score that level 4 even if there wasn't that smoky quality to it, because there's enough of the fermentiness and the fruit qualities to take away from it not scoring that level 4 regardless. So 2 kind of knocks on the overall cleanliness. Even then, I would say still slightly above average for a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. So that's the most important thing worth highlighting and discussing in this tasting wheel. So as I am looking at it, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. It won't come as a surprise to anybody that I really was a little let down by this coffee, especially given the first impression that I had had of this coffee the first time around. I can't go back and highlight enough just how impressive that sample was, because it probably was going to be our favorite natural processed Ethiopian coffee that we had ever reviewed on this channel, and I do regret not purchasing it at that time. And the feedback that Airworks received about that coffee that they did release on their subscription was outstanding. They had heard so many positive things and feedback from so many people, to the point where it was one of the best coffees that Airworks had released at that time. And I would say probably in hindsight, one of the best coffees that they had released in the entirety of 2024. And one that once again would have finished easily in the top 5 of our top 10 coffees of 2024 list. So an opportunity missed out, and I wish that this coffee could have been along the same lines. It is the same coffee, it's just roasted a little different, which is kind of unfortunate, but I've decided that we're going to wait to get some feedback from people on Wes Ngopi after a little bit of time, because I'm curious to see what their profile might look like. I think it just takes them some time to adjust to a new roasting machine, and once they get it right, then I'm hoping that their profile will be a little bit more similar to either what we had first experienced from them back in July or what we had experienced from them, I would say, a little bit thereafter, as I did enjoy both of those experiences of this coffee. It's just this one right here and the Catalina Gesha that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of, that I've had some much more mixed impressions of all around. So we'll just kind of see what happens from here. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It is still very classic natural Ethiopian, as it does offer an abundance of those blueberry qualities to it. Very pronounced, very intense, and in addition to that, just a lot of fruit qualities to it. A lot of those more perfumey, intense florals as well. Great sweetness and a lot of intense, long-lasting finish. A lot of intense, long-lasting finish is, I don't even know what I'm saying to that. You get what I'm saying. Regardless, that's kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd definitely love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Niguse Gemeda Slow Shade Drying Natural Processed Ethiopia from Wes Ngopi. Thank you for watching.